so much for coming. Thank you for the patience. And I know some people were late because of the treacherous, not as treacherous as their route. The subway was paralyzed today. My name is Rose Tang. I'm a Mongol Chinese activist, survivor of Tiananmen massacre. And thank you so much for inviting me.
你带那两个除了嘉许，另外那个没问题吧？
没问题，就说普通的。
So we're going to invite you to ask questions. First, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
That mountain path, is it Nampala?
So the story was inspired by the incident on Nangpala, which was 2006, when 16-year-old. Sorry. You know, my voice doesn't allow me to speak loud. This particular hall, this hall doesn't have a mic, but the other one does. Tenzing, you will have to do all the speaking. I will just.
So, Rose asked the question whether the pass in the film was Nangpala Pass. Nangpala is this kind of very high mountain pass between Nepal and Tibet. It's a pass that Tibetans used quite often when they escaped from Tibet. And Nangpala Pass itself is at about 19,000 feet. But, I mean, yeah, we couldn't go to Nangpala. So this was shot in Ladakh, obviously. And it was at about 15,000 feet that we shot the scenes on the pass. We tried to get as close to the actual pass as we could, I mean, in terms of the feeling.
Could you tell us about the killings at Nampala Pass?
Sure. So for those of you who may not know, the film kind of was inspired by an incident that took place in September 2006 on the Nangpala Pass, when a group of Tibetans were escaping and Chinese border guards opened fire and killed a young nun, a 16-year-old nun. Now this particular incident was captured on video by a Romanian mountain climber who happened to be in the vicinity, and he made this footage public. So it was the first time that those of us who lived in exile saw what actually was happening on these high mountain passes when Tibetans were escaping. That not only were they facing the incredible kind of physical hardships of the environment, but they were faced with the challenge of escaping Chinese border guards who had no compunction about shooting them in cold blood. So that was the incident that sparked the thinking about this film. And at the same time, what really kind of what made us think a lot about this incident was that a lot of these people who were escaping from Tibet were young children. I mean, they were often 4 or 5 or 6 years old, and they were being sent by their families to India to get a Tibetan education in one of the refugee schools set up by the Dalai Lama's government. So we kind of wanted to explore this question of who were these kids, what happened to them when they grew up, because often they never went back to Tibet, they lost contact with their families, and so they lived a kind of a very different life from other Tibetan exiles in India, and we wanted to explore that, and that's how the film kind of originated.
Any questions from the floor, please?
I'm curious that these Chinese spies who came into Delhi, did that actually happen? Like, can they just walk into Delhi and walk into an apartment and beat someone up?
You want to repeat the questions?
So the question is about the two Tibetans who are Chinese agents, and whether they actually exist, and whether they can just walk into people's homes and beat them up and threaten them. In India. Of course, in the film, I've taken some liberties with the two characters, because I wanted to present a scenario for Tibetan audiences, for us to think about, the fact that, for so long we've seen the whole Tibet kind of situation as a black and white situation, like it's the Chinese are the bad guys and Tibetans are the good guys. But 60 years, after the occupation, there are so many Tibetans who do work for Chinese security services, who do, work for the police department, who are often sometimes even more cruel than the Chinese are when it comes to dealing with Tibetan political prisoners in Tibet. So I wanted to kind of bring that into the picture just to make us reflect on it. But to answer your question about is it possible? Yes, absolutely. There have been several cases of Tibetan spies sent from from Tibet, infiltrating the Tibetan exile community, and yeah, there have been some pretty bad cases as well. So
Can
it
I
does
add?
happen.
Can I add? I can't wait. A few years ago, I was approached by a Tibetan man who introduced me to an Indian diplomat who was posing as an Indian diplomat, asking me to monitor the activists from Tibet, Tibetan activists. This is happening in New York. And there have been Chinese spies threatening us indirectly, infiltrating even the Chinese dissident community, taking photos of the dissidents' kids going to school, exposing their home addresses online. This is very real. I'm talking about this has been happening in New York. You shocked?
Can you talk about the self-immolation and the footage that's coming out? Is it still coming out?
Okay, so the question is about the self-immolations, the footage that you saw in the film. So starting in about 2009, which was the first recorded incident of a self-immolation inside Tibet. So starting from then, all through 2010, 11 and 12, there was a spate of self-immolations. Today it numbers about 154. It's kind of slowed down in the last couple of years, mainly because the Chinese authorities have figured out new ways of controlling it. One of them being targeting families of self-immolators. So if a person self-immolates, their families are going to go to prison, charged with aiding and abetting them. So that's kind of really slowed down the self-immolation movement. So the film is set in that period around 2011, 2012, when self-immolations were happening. Almost every day we were getting reports that, there's been another self-immolation in Tibet. And in the early stages of this whole kind of spate of self-immolations, people were able to send cell phone images out to us in exile. So we were able to actually see what was happening. That's all stopped now.
Yes.
I know this is fairly common, but I'm unclear on why the mother and the sister did not, why the family didn't emigrate as one.
I can't answer.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to have to.
Sorry. We live in different halls and some have accents to it.
So the kind of second wave of Tibetan refugees started coming to India in the late 1980s, and all through the 90s and 2000s until about 2008, there were about 2,000 to 3,000 Tibetans coming to India, most of them crossing these high mountain passes. A lot of them were kids who were sent by their families, either brought by one parent or actually just entrusted in the care of some guide or some relative or friend going to India, with the sole aim of having them educated in a Tibetan refugee school in India, because that was something that the Tibetan education was something they didn't have in Tibet itself. Now I guess a lot of these parents were thinking about their kids and their future. They believed that it was better for them to be in India, so they would send usually one of their kids. I mean, they didn't send all their kids to India. And the question why they wouldn't all immigrate is because they had their lives back in Tibet. They had their own families, they were villagers or they were nomads, so they couldn't all just immigrate en masse.
I'd like to encourage Chinese friends to ask some questions. I'm sure you have some questions, and I'd like to thank you all for coming here. Coming here takes a lot of courage. You may face danger just by coming here. And you do not want to ask questions now, you're very welcome to ask them later. And it was 5 years ago when you talked about the high spate of self-immolations. There was a story in New York Times talking about this collective silence from the Chinese, and I was pretty shocked. That's when I started to work on the Tibetan cause. Because for the Chinese, even for Chinese dissidents, Tibet is quite a taboo. Once you touch it, Usually the top rule would be Tiananmen, Taiwan, and Tibet, and East Turkestan, 4 T's. Once you touch it, you may be banned from China forever. I am so thrilled. There are at least a dozen Chinese in the audience. Some are young Chinese students, activists, and filmmakers. And thank you so much for people from other countries as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Getting back to the story about, the question about the families breaking up, would the intention have been that the father would have delivered the daughter to India and then tried to return?
Absolutely.
I see.
Yes, absolutely. There's one other case of an escape from Tibet that's actually been documented. It was a Swiss photographer who's actually a friend of ours, Manuel Bauer. He accompanied a father and a daughter across Nampala Pass and filmed the journey. And a lot of the imagery in the film is taken from the photographs he shot. And that father dropped his daughter off, went back to Tibet, and the daughter is now, I think, early 30s, and she works in a hotel in Delhi, and she has never seen her parents again.
I have such a friend who lives in Jackson Heights, and unfortunately he has to work today. When he took that route, escaping Tibet, he's from Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. He was 9 years old. He was hiding in a truck in some boxes of goods, and the Chinese soldiers were using bayonets to stab the boxes, and luckily he survived. And another Tibetan refugee I met in Chicago, she was 7 months pregnant and she walked that path. Luckily, of course, she was very slow and her feet and legs were swollen up. Luckily, all her members of her group waited for her. And now she's in Chicago with her husband and her children, happily ever after. And she's one of the very few lucky ones. I've heard so many horrendous stories of people. Literally, it's not that they're being told to leave the sick and the injured by the road. They just couldn't afford it. They just had to move on and just let them die. And those kids, they are separated from their parents forever.
So are you saying these trips are still going on right now on a daily basis?
No. So what happened was in 2008, the year of the Beijing Olympics, you know that there was a huge uprising all across the Tibetan Plateau, and of course that was timed to draw the world's attention to Tibet at the time when Beijing was going to have its Olympics. It was also timed because it was the next year was the 50th anniversary of 1959, the year that the Dalai Lama fled Tibet. So those demonstrations and protests really took the Chinese government by surprise. They didn't expect that there was such a kind of widespread kind of feeling of discontent and unhappiness with Chinese rule. So once the Olympics were over and the international attention turned somewhere else, they really cracked down really heavily in Tibet. And one of the things they did was to beef up the border security. And today, so since 2008, the number of refugees crossing those mountains has pretty much completely stopped. I think last year about 20 people came from Tibet. So they're using very high-tech surveillance methods on the borders, sending drones to patrol the borders. All kinds of high-tech surveillance methods are being used.
They also have a larger presence in Nepal now, right?
Absolutely,
So
that's
now
right.
Chinese are being taught in schools.
That's
and,
right.
Even Chinese currency being used in Nepal. So
And people are not allowed to celebrate His Holiness the Dalai Lama's birthday
In Nepal.
in Nepal.
So Nepal has also become a proxy Chinese state now. I mean, even in those days, like in the 2000s, when people were crossing the mountains, if they were caught by Nepali border guards, they were often sent back to Tibet. So even after they crossed the pass, they had to be really careful about not being caught by Nepali border guards. But now, of course, it's even worse.
I have a question.
Sorry.
Yeah, she has to do.
It sounds like a question because I'm very wondering
Thank you. Yunnan.
Yes.
That's the southwestern province bordering Burma and Thailand.
And Tibet also.
Tibet, yes, of course, yes.
Yeah.
I didn't quite follow your question. Can you just ask it one more time?
So why do they want
Could you
to
speak
up a bit?
Why do they want to escape from Tibet?
Yes.
Oh, because there's many reasons why Tibetans would want to escape from Tibet. One of them, in that period, it was really to do with the education of their children, because getting a Tibetan education in Tibet was very difficult, was not available, and that's become even worse now. Today, there's almost no Tibetans not taught in schools, pretty much. So there's no access to a Tibetan education. So that was one reason. The other reason is because the Dalai Lama lives in India, and for all Tibetans in Tibet, their dream is to be near the Dalai Lama. So if they can send one kid to India, then they think that, okay, at least that kid will be next to the Dalai Lama and will have the blessings. So that was something that was really important to them as well, to have a kind of a connection to the Dalai Lama.
To add to your question and to answer, it's not stupid at all, it's a great question. Thank you. Once I was with my Tibetan friends doing goshe, the traditional Tibetan circle dance in a little square in Jackson Heights, and there were some Chinese residents taking photos and asking me, and how come they're not speaking Mandarin? Aren't they from China? I said, no, they're from Tibet. They said, well, they should be speaking Mandarin, right? Part of China. I said, no. Tibet is a different country, being occupied and colonized by China. And look at all these Tibetans, they're all refugees who escaped Tibet. And the Chinese residents were like, what? Aren't they happy? Why did they have to become refugees? I said, go figure, and why don't you just Google Tibet and the Dalai Lama?
The police and the suppression of their people.
Absolutely. There's, besides just lack of access to the Tibetan language education, Tibet is like a police state. It's bad in China in some ways, in the sense that in China also you can't say, you can't kind of, delve into politics or criticize the government. But in Tibet, it's at a totally different level. There are kind of cultural revolution era practices going on in Tibet, like patriotic re-education campaigns, where they send Communist Party members into monasteries, have the monks do re-education campaigns, where part of the thing is they have to denounce the Dalai Lama. It's like a part of the re-education that they have to go through. So there's a lot of repression in Tibet. Religion is, Buddhism is not freely being allowed to be practiced. I could go on and on. There's the situation in Tibet is pretty bad at the moment.
One last question, please.
Yeah, explain to me, please, why the Chinese authorities wouldn't encourage Tibetans to leave. Because the fewer Tibetans there are, it's less of a problem for them, wouldn't it be?
Yeah.
That would be a good
Yeah, exactly.
I think
They don't even encourage the Chinese to leave. Detain them at the border. They shoot them too.
There are 6 million Tibetans in Tibet, so it would be hard to get them all to leave. And in any case, why should they leave? Tibet is their country. That's the land that was their ancestors, and they've always lived there.
No, I'm not saying they should leave. I'm asking why don't the Chinese encourage them to leave?
The other reason is also because China is very insecure about its control over Tibet. The Chinese government knows that it acquired Tibet illegally, that it's colonizing Tibet. So it doesn't want to be seen to be in the international kind of space. It doesn't want to be seen as if it's pushing the Tibetans out. Their narrative is really that, we've made the Tibetans really happy. We brought development to Tibet. Why are these people so ungrateful? So it's a common colonial trope that we see.
There's one person who will try to ask a question. Maybe that's the last one. Yes.
I wanted to know about, sort of piggybacking off the Nepal question, how fragile is the diplomatic relationship between India and China? And how often does that play into the situation?
No, I think that the relationship between India and China and Tibet in between there, is kind of changes all the time. So it depends on who's in power and also the bureaucrats in power in Delhi and China. And now it's at a time where it's quite tricky because I think trade, they are trying to really increase trade between the two countries, and so it's a complicated time. It's changed over the years, yes.
But having said that, Tibetans in India still enjoy a huge amount of freedom that they probably wouldn't have received in any other country. Because in India, Tibetans, we live a completely parallel life. We have our own education systems, we have our own monasteries. So in that sense, the Indian government has been good to us.
Yeah. Okay, we have to go.
I think we'll do it 1 minute. Apologize to Tibetan friends in the audience for what the Chinese government has done to your country and your people and your culture and your religion, all the atrocities. I am very sorry. It's my ritual when I meet Tibetan friends, and I like to offer my gratitude using the Tibetan custom. Kada. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for coming. And you're welcome to, if you have time, ask them more questions.
可以结束
可以结束了。